Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of My Bigfoot Sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of run-down no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let me know.
My Bigfoot sighting happened 40 miles from downtown Chicago. My name is Norman Sollie. I'm a carpenter and an author. I've been interested in Sasquatch for a long, long time. I'm the stereotypical story. I first was introduced to Sasquatch through the Patterson-Gimlin film in a theater in Seattle, Washington. I saw what was at that time a short movie. This would have been late 60s, early 70s. And I went on just the stereotype. I read everything I could read on Sasquatch. Going to the library, I accumulated a few books. John Green was a big deal. Grover Krantz, being from the same state I was in, influenced me quite a bit also. Renee Dawhinden, etc. And I grew up believing that the Pacific Northwest, and really just the Pacific Northwest, had an extremely rare, elusive mountain ape. That was my mindset. So I operated under this mindset. I wrote an article for my high school newspaper on Sasquatch. I was pretty obsessed, frankly. And eventually, I even did a little bit of field work. And I think I'm not going to talk about that field work today, except to say it was the beginning of me starting to think that there was something strange about these elusive mountain apes, because I experienced the you gotta leave now feeling. Not in a frightening way. It was just a very insistent push out of an area that I'd gone to deliberately looking for Sasquatch. And eventually I did what I don't even want to call myself a researcher in that sense, but what people interested in Sasquatch often do. I hit a point where I thought, this is just nuts. It doesn't make any sense. And it really didn't. I was starting to get the logic of the situation was unraveling around the edges. And about 1984, I thought, I just got to drop this. I'm not going to get anywhere. This is an unsolvable mystery. Not that that's changed, but I just got to let it go. And I let it go for literally decades. It was around 2006 or so that I went to a spiritual retreat not terribly far from downtown Chicago. It was 2 miles outside of Woodstock, Illinois, which is where the exterior scenes of the Bill Murray movie Groundhog's Day were shot. So literally, the story I'm about to tell was about 2 miles from a small town city streets setting where Bill Murray had been. So this spiritual retreat was at an old Catholic center. It had inside of it a church. It also had lots of small overnight rooms for the people at the retreat to stay in. And I was living on the property where the retreat was. It was 4 or 5 days, something like that. And I quickly, when I had breaks in the lectures and the classes, I would take walks on the grounds. And these grounds were about 40 acres, heavily wooded, mostly deciduous trees, very tall canopy, It was probably maples, oaks, elm, ash. I'm not great on Midwest trees. I'm more of a Northwest or West Coast kind of a person. But it was very large, old trees, high canopy, actually pretty good visibility under the canopy, but fairly dark just because of the leaf cover overhead. It was mid to late summer. On one of my walks around the grounds, I had found this funny side trail off of the Moan area. There was what I call a big boy trail. Now I call it that. At the time, I thought, why are people walking around here out of sight of the buildings and going into the woods here? It didn't make much sense to me. But there was this big, heavy, trodden trail. It was literally 3 or 4 feet wide. So I thought, I'm going to explore this next chance I get. So on a break, instead of doing what the few other walkers would do, they would go out the back of the building and head on an established groomed trail into the woods. I zipped out the front of the building and went around this stretch of woods so I could get into the trail at this point. And I got onto this trail, and I'm thinking spiritual thoughts, mind you. I'm groovy. I'm semi-enlightened. I'm mocking myself, of course. But I'm not really present in my surroundings. I'm deep inside my head. I'm still carrying that meditative state out into the woods with me and not paying much attention to my surroundings. I walk on this trail, and I'd gotten out of the building so quickly, even as I started curving back around to the left towards this main trail I usually walked on, I was a bit ahead of the other people, but I could hear them coming through the woods. I'm walking along, thinking my holy thoughts, and I become just vaguely aware that there's a figure in the woods down below me near this main trail that I normally would have walked on. And I'm not even paying attention to this figure yet, but it sticks and has stuck in my head what that figure was doing. The figure was obviously spying on the approaching people. And I could hear their voices and hear the sounds of them coming. But this figure was high-stepping through the brush. It was carefully stepping down toe first on the ground, stepping over things, and it was swiveling its head back and forth. It was obviously spying on the approaching people. Not in really a threatening way. It just seemed very curious. Another reason why I didn't really think about this figure initially, it was only about 5 feet 6 inches tall. This was not a tall being by any means. But what was odd about it was uniformly matte black. In that lighting under the trees, it was really just a silhouette for me. I couldn't make out any details of face, but it seemed normally proportioned, a rounded head. But its behavior was odd, and it didn't show any clothing colors. There was not, for instance, a change between a cuff and the hand, or the bottom of the pants and the shoes. It was uniform. There weren't any transitions. It was just this matte black, and it was fuzzy around the edges. And at the time in my spiritual mode, I actually, when I started paying attention, I thought I was seeing some sort of spiritual manifestation, particularly with that fuzziness and the all black. I actually thought it was maybe one of the teachers doing something out of body or in some weird Akashic form or something. It didn't make sense, and I had nothing by which to judge what I was seeing. I'm finally starting to pay real attention to this figure. I'm starting to realize that this is not quite right, when in its stealthiness, it appears to step behind a large tree trunk. And I wait for it because it's like moving, it's not slowing down. It just like moves, from my point of view, behind this tree trunk. And it is at this point maybe 150 feet away in the woods. And it never comes back out from behind the tree trunk. That's it. And I think to myself, where did it go? And right about then, people start coming into view. It would have been from me on the far side of those people, not terribly far, maybe 50 feet off the trail, something like that. And it never reappeared. On that same property, there was another area outside of the trees. It was a low swampy area, lots of brush, lots of open cattails and the like, and it just looked interesting to me. And I thought I'd go explore it one day on one of my breaks. And I head down into that swampy area, and I get that sense of, no, not the place to go. And I'm still not thinking Sasquatch, but I turned around and I left. That's one of the things so remarkable to me about this phenomenon, is it can be so subtle that we're not even aware that we're being played or manipulated, but I think often we are. And if you think about that, think about how many times maybe people, ourselves included, are reacting to whatever's in the woods and being totally unconscious about that. We leave an area we thought we were going to go into. We take the right fork on a trail instead of the left fork, etc. It's when I look back on some of these events that I realize, wow, that was completely out of character for me. Why did I do that? Nothing obvious was going on to make me turn around and go the other way. So I wonder about that swampy area too. I wonder if that was maybe a daytime hangout. But I don't know. It took years before I looked back on this Woodstock, Illinois event. I believe what happened is I was listening to a podcast and somebody had an experience even closer to Chicago. And it was then, that was probably just a juvenile Sasquatch. And it was doing what the kids do. It was spying on the people, enjoying itself. And I also suspect that my state of mind was part of the reason why I was able to kind of get the jump on it, because I wasn't thinking about my surroundings. I was in a meditative state. I was focused on one thing. I wasn't giving out a loud signal around me. I also suspect there was probably bigger ones around that maybe were aware I was there and maybe did signal the youngin to get under cover, but I don't know. That's just a suspicion. I've gone on to have events in many states. I mentioned Washington State and Colorado. I found stick structures in Colorado. Illinois, we talked about. I've had events in Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts of all places, in a very rural, very heavily wooded area. But I thought I'd talk about the state I live in right now, which is Alaska. Alaska seems to catch the interest of a lot of people in the Sasquatch world. I came up here, frankly, originally in 1984, thinking I didn't really have to think about Sasquatch. It was obviously way too cold for Sasquatch to be up here. How could they deal with the winter temperatures? That's still a question, by the way, in my head. But I was eventually to find out that there seems to be plenty of activity up here, and some of it I have experienced myself. In fact, quite a range of activity. It wasn't, though, until really about the 2012 specifically, that I really started thinking about Sasquatch in Alaska. And this was after I rejoined the Sasquatch world. And I did that through realizing I had to rethink how I thought about Sasquatch. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And I was interested to find that in this interior Alaska area I live in, which is north of the Alaska Range and hundreds of miles away from the ocean, I found out that you can find sightings on the internet in this immediate area. I am standing right now within sight of Denali National Park and Preserve. It is a large national park that actually has Mount McKinley or Denali, depending upon your preference, in it, which is the tallest mountain in North America. So this is a very mountainous area. There's a lot of wilderness. The land touched by humans is way dwarfed by the land that's untouched. Generally, in this part of the world, you climb over the next hill and you're all by yourself. So I came up here for a woman. I had been away for 15 years. I had the chance to come back up. There was a woman involved, I admit. I didn't move in with her immediately, but one thing she did early on is warn me that the house that she lives in makes lots of noises. And that was an odd statement to me. I said, what do you mean it makes noises? And she said, well, it just makes noises, and you just need to know if you're going to spend time here that it's a noisy house. And I couldn't get anything out of her more than that it makes noises. And as some of you know, there's a lot of people out there that just do not want to engage with this subject, and you can't blame them. It is scary, and if you're a woman living alone, you don't want to think about the things that are going bump in the night. You want to think that your house makes noises. So when I started spending more time here, and I was to move in a few months, I started looking around the property. It's a 5-acre lot. It's in a subdivision of 5-acre lots. So it's about 80% wooded here. It is very easy to move under cover through this subdivision. But there are some dogs, and sometimes you hear them barking a heck of a lot. I took a look around her property, and I noticed a couple odd things. One was near the roadway. There seemed to be a blind type of thing where I could imagine something powerful pulling trees, standing living trees together to make a place to stand behind. That's what it looked like. A couple of the trees were still living. A couple of them had died by being snapped and broken into place. When I first moved in here, my ex-girlfriend used to take showers outdoors back behind her house. She didn't have indoor plumbing at that point. So she had a place about 80 feet from where I'm standing right now. I can look out at it where she used to take these outdoor showers. And she's not a bad looking woman. I don't know if that's apropos to the story, but about 50, 60 feet from where she took those showers, I found behind some screening trees a beaten down area. The ground is all trampled there. It's about 10 feet in diameter, a rounded area behind these trees that also have a view of the front windows of this house. My girlfriend actually built this house. She's a carpenter. She put in lots of south-facing windows. You feel like you're in a goldfish bowl when you're in the great room. So there's this matted down area. I go to my ex-girlfriend and I ask her, why is this area all matted down over here? And she says, I don't know. Maybe people in the old days used to camp there or something. I don't know. And I didn't want to push the subject. I'm already thinking, I think something's been spying on my ex-girlfriend, at the time girlfriend, when she's using the shower area and when she's in the main room of the house. So I move in. We're sitting on the futon one day in the same great room with all the windows. It is dark. It's fall by this point of 2012. She won't allow the curtains to be drawn. She's got curtains, but she doesn't want condensation on the windows because it'll drip down and land on the windowsills and rot the windowsills. And she's a carpenter, so wood is everything. you do not harm the wood. We're on the futon. We're watching a movie or something. We're facing a window across the great room, but this is the cabin. By great room, I'm talking 20 feet away. And suddenly there's a stereotypical bang on the side of the house right under that window. I did not do what people normally do at times like that. Instead, I leapt out and I rushed out of the house to confront whatever it was that did it. And I was thinking it might be a Sasquatch, but for some reason my protect the woman genes were functioning at that point. I ran out there, nothing, of course, nothing at all. There was even patchy snow outside. I could not find a track. It was very mysterious to me, but it was also, it was very definitely a bang on the side of the house, like a large hand had slapped it with great violence. And like some of these things seem to have, for me anyhow, there was a feeling attached to this incident. And the feeling is that a young male had come here and found me in the house and was angry about it and had banged the house at that point. But I think also me rushing outside didn't fit the pattern. And I think I actually scared whatever it was. And the house stopped making noises. And we didn't have more bangs on the house, which is interesting. And I would ask her about why the house no longer made noises, and she had no good explanation for that. A few other things have happened in this rural neighborhood. One is, one day somebody posted on Facebook warning people that there were tracks in the snow, and she could tell that somebody had been trying to get into her vehicles. I just thought that was odd. This is rural Alaska. You don't walk in the snow and try to get into people's vehicles. That didn't make much sense to me. I keep hearing about these things that are just a little bit off. Another thing that would happen here at this house, which I have lived in for years, is I would step outside at night in the dark, and I would hear mumbling voices. I would hear a conversation of what appeared to be males, and it seemed to be coming from near another cabin that's about 500-600 feet away from here, but maybe off a little bit and into the woods. And I asked my girlfriend about this, and I asked her who was living down there, and she said, well, nobody's living down there. It's vacant. It was just one of those weird things. Another time we were hiking on a trail in Denali National Park, and we were going up some switchbacks, leaving the creek bottom below. We were in woods. These were white spruce woods. They're not huge trees, but it does provide forest cover around here. There would have been some birch, some aspen around, a few willows. And this is Alaska. Not a lot of people on the trails, but, a few. We saw maybe a handful that day. From below us sounded what seemed to be a kid imitating a train whistle. And it wasn't coming from the trail below us. It was coming off the side a little further up the creek. And we just looked at each other. And I just thought, it must be a kid, I guess. But we never saw a kid on that hike that day. I never ran into a kid to suspect had been trying to imitate a train whistle sound. There is, in fact, railroad tracks here. And whomever that kid was probably did hear train whistles frequently. And the tracks weren't even that far away. But the sound was not coming from the direction of the tracks, and obviously was not a real train. Another time I was by myself exploring a creek bottom near here, about 3 miles as the crow flies. And I don't think this was Sasquatch related, but in an area of beaver ponds, up on the side of the bank, a little above the ponds, I was just kind of messing around, looking around, and I found a muddy area concealed from the ponds by some brush. And there were lots of tracks there, but they were smaller tracks. They were like kid size, maybe a 10-year-old kid. But what was interesting about the tracks in the mud, they didn't show treads, but they also didn't show toes. They looked like they were made of moccasins. That was the sense of those impressions that I got. And I don't know if you know, but Alaska has native lore of 4 different types of odd creatures in the primate realm. There is Sasquatch, the hairy man. That's talked about quite a bit. There's also a 4 to 5 foot biped that is a little bit more technologically advanced. They're reported to wear some clothing, hides and the like, and even maybe to use bows and arrows and spears. And the natives say that they follow the caribou. They also say they're pretty aggressive and mean and you don't want to tangle with them, whereas the Sasquatch is considered more of a neutral in many areas. There are areas that Sasquatch seems to have a bad attitude in Alaska, and there's literally areas that we call no-go areas, where particularly amongst the natives, it's just understood you don't want to go up this river valley. It's just a bad place to go. So I've wondered about those small tracks that I found in the brush that day. Wondered what that might be, and I actually got out of that area because I knew about that rep for that size being in Alaska. Another thing I found in this rural subdivision, my ex-girlfriend and I were exploring a bit in the woods, not in the subdivision, but just off a little ways, a mile or so, and we went to the top of a low hill, and we found the remains of 2 moose. These were just skeletal remains. They were scattered about a little bit, but obviously it was 2 moose at the top of this hill, only about 25 feet apart from each other. And we thought, hey, that's interesting, and moved on. And it took a couple years before it occurred to me, wait a second, that makes no sense. The moose aren't going to die at the same time, or B, one moose is not going to go find where another moose died and make a point of dying there. That just makes no sense. There is no moose graveyard. And also the top of a hill, that's kind of an odd place for a moose to go to die naturally, if a moose ever dies naturally. So it struck me as odd. We generally don't have grizzlies or wolves taking down adult moose, which were what the remains indicated, right around the subdivision. The wolves and the grizzlies tend to stay back a bit because there's people here. It took another couple years before somebody told me that the gravel pit that's only about 500 feet from the place where we found these moose remains is where the local Department of Transportation dumps the road-killed moose and caribou on the upper part of the pit, a little away from public eye. So since then I've wondered, did something carry these enormously heavy moose carcasses up to the top of that hill where they felt they were safe to sit and enjoy their meal? I wonder about that. I have spent some time working in Denali National Park. I worked out at what's called Toklat Road Camp, which is 53 miles into the park. An amazing place to be for somebody like me who loves to hike in the outdoors. My boss there, he told me that odd things happen at Toklat. I could never get him to quite explain what he was talking about. One of the things he said is, over the course of winters when nobody's there and the camp is totally snowed in and the road is snowed in, you have to go 50 miles to get to the nearest open road. He said things would disappear over the winter, things that were left outside of the buildings. One thing he mentioned was ladders, which, God help us if Sasquatch is stealing ladders. Maybe that's how they're looking into second-story windows. Over the course of the years I spent out there, I ran into some odd things myself. One time I decided to try to climb a nearby mountain, and I had to hike downstream on the Toklat River, which people do occasionally, but it's less used. I hiked downstream, and I had to hike through this area called Bear Draw, a tributary creek. And it's a horrible name because you cannot hike without thinking, as you're going through this V-shaped valley on this creek bottom, that if a bear is coming down and you're going up, you're going to run into the bear. And you're not going to have a lot of visual warning. You're going to see that bear when it's pretty close to you. But I managed to get up. I climbed my mountain, Mount Sheldon, if anybody wants to look on the maps. I came back down. I'm getting through Bear Draw. It's starting to open up a little. I'm starting to breathe easier and not worry so much. I'm getting out into the bright sun. There's a good 50 feet of open space on my right and my left. And I hear from the woods a single syllable. And the syllable is, "Oi." And that's actually a pretty good imitation. That one's really stuck in my head. And at this point, I'm big into the Sasquatch stuff. Everywhere I go, I'm looking for Sasquatch stuff, looking for tracks, looking for sign. And I have this internal argument with myself. I say, I should go into those dark woods and see what made that sound. And I say that, and I think, there is no way I'm going into those dark woods. I'm not going to do it. And I kept on walking out to the broad glacial river bar that I was headed for, where you've got a mile of gravel. You can see forever, and you don't have to worry about anything sneaking up on you. That's what I did. Months later, maybe more, I was listening to an M.K. Davis video where I think it's called something like Shed Sounds or Shop Sounds, something like that. And it's just CCTV recording, and nothing showed up on the TV itself, but it's mounted on the side of what I presume is a shop building, and you could hear something rummaging in the shop. And it is bizarre because whatever it is kind of talking to itself, but it's not good at speaking English, but it seems to be practicing English. And it's practicing what it seems to be hearing coming from the shed at times. Like you can hear it saying, "Where to go, where to go?" As if somebody has lost something and he's looking for it. But then at 4 minutes and 35 seconds, it starts seeming to be practicing the word hi. And you can hear hi, hi, hi. But then the last attempt, it goes, hoy. It was just what I heard on a side tributary in Denali National Park and Preserve, a continent away from where those sounds were recorded. And that was one strange experience for me to hear that sound on an M.K. Davis video. Eventually, in 2016, in the winter, I took a snow machine supported trip just near the park border, but I and 2 or 3 other people rode fat tire bikes. Fat tire bikes, big inflated tires. If you have compacted snow and ice, you can ride these things in the winter on trails. And I rode it, and going that way, it's about a 5.5 hour trip into where there are a few cabins, like 2 or 3. So I had somebody to carry the bulk of my stuff, and it was a great trip, great experience. But I'm trying to get the sense of this was remote. This was 25 miles past the last plowed road. It was also, to get there, we passed the bus that McCandless starved to death in, the Into the Wild McCandless. This is where we were at. We were upstream of that bus. And we stopped at the bus because while the bus was still there, it's gone now. That was, of course, an interesting place to stop and was on the trail. So we go in there, and we're literally in a cabin an eighth of a mile from the park boundary, Denali National Park. We are on private land, but we're very close to the park. The first morning I'm there, I decide I'm going to walk upstream on this frozen river bar. And this was an area of open tundra, but down on the drainages, you would have white spruce, you would have cottonwoods, willows. So there'd be ribbons of tree cover along these drainages, but then as the land climbed up on both sides, it would open up into dwarf birch, blueberries, moss, etc. More of an open tundra situation. So I head upstream on this frozen river bar. It's ice. There had been a bit of a thaw about 2 weeks before, and then there'd been maybe 3/4 of an inch of snow on top of it, and the temperature had settled into not frigid, it was about 15 degrees, but it's winter and it's very short days. I'm going up and it's gloomy. I left not that early, but because it's winter, the sun isn't up, and I don't think at that place it was going to come up. So it's very, very dim out. The first odd thing I find is some scat right on the ice associated with some tracks. There had also been a National Park Service dog team had gone up right between the scat and the tracks, and I could see that trail going through, but I could see these older tracks, and they were confusing to me. They weren't actually a typical Sasquatch track. They were more hourglass shaped, and it looks like they had been made during this thaw, which is probably a period of high wind. It is typically when you get thaws up here along the river valleys. So they were somewhat melted out. I couldn't see any treads and I couldn't see any toes, but they were large. They were larger than my pack-booted foot, which means about 13 inches long, I believe. And I was confused because I seemed to be only seeing the right side of the tracks, the right feet spread apart about 4 feet apart. I couldn't see the left feet. I thought that they were lost within the dog team tracks. And then I finally realized, oh, wait a second. I am seeing both right and left. At this point, I didn't know about the tightrope walking thing where Sasquatch tracks generally are pretty much in a straight line as opposed to straddling a straight line as in humans. I think I was seeing both sides of the tracks. It was just a 4-foot stride. So my mind wasn't calibrated for the scale of what I was seeing. So I found that scat in the tracks. The scat was a large pile. It was not out of the question for human, but it would have been a lot of scat for human. No hair in it. I couldn't see any vegetative matter. I would guess it was feeding on meat, whatever it was, but no expert there. I continue on up the river bar. Next thing I find is there's an area of gravel that has been blown free of snow, but it is in the ice. It's surrounded by ice. There's literal ice right there coming up to this mound of gravel. About 3 feet off the gravel bar, there are 5 rocks lined up in a row on the ice, perfectly spaced. They're just little pebbles, 1 inch to 2 inch wide, maybe. They're lined up, just 5 of them there, and they're also partly melted into the ice, so I can tell that they would have been placed there during or before that thaw. And it looked like something had been sitting on the bare gravel and just kind of messing around with rocks, is the impression I got. I continue up the river bar, and I go around a curve, and I come upon this big expanse where I can see quite a ways. The banks have dropped away or dropped back from the creek. And these were not loud, but I heard 4 knocks, and they were spread out knocks. two were on one side of the creek, two were on the other. And trees can make cracking noises in cold, but it usually happens when the temperature is changing. The temperature had been steady there for days. I don't know what these knocks were, but at the time, I felt like they were being made rather than just something that was happening through natural processes. And I actually, at that point, already starting to appreciate that there's some weird things about the phenomenon. I actually said out loud, I mean no harm, just taking a walk. I'm going to head back downstream now to the cabin where we're all staying, just to warn you. Others of my party, I believe, are going to come up the stream later today. They mean no harm. They're just going to go up the ice and come back down again. And they did, in fact, do that. And one of them, when she got back to the cabin where I was at, she remarked that she'd found these rocks on the ice. And she said, those were not natural. She could tell that was not some weird combination of nature blowing rocks out onto ice. She knew they'd been set there, and she was mystified about it too. What's interesting about her is she was the wife of a former National Park Service upper management person. And that upper management person was with us. And I told this upper management person and everybody there about what I'd been finding and my suspicion that maybe I was seeing Sasquatch sign in the middle of winter in that area on the edge of Denali National Park and Preserve. And instead of telling me that I was crazy, when I said that, you know, each one of these things you could maybe explain, he stopped me and said, well, just keep thinking about that there are alternative explanations. It doesn't have to be Bigfoot. And I just thought that was an odd reaction. He didn't tell me I was nuts. He didn't tell me that there's no Bigfoot around here. He just told me focus on the fact that there are other explanations. That was just interesting to me. In April of 2016, one of my coworkers told me about an incident in which a dog team in the Cantwell, Alaska area had disappeared. Dog teams up here are kept outdoors. This was a winter event when they disappeared. They're kept on chains to their collars. They each have their own doghouse. This was a freight hauling team. These were large dogs. Freight hauling dogs can weigh up to 100 pounds. They're big dogs. These are Alaskan Huskies. They're very closely in touch with their wolf roots. But the explanation was that wolves got this team. And that just always struck me as odd. And the dogs just disappeared. It wasn't like a mass carnage scene. They were just gone. So that was a funny one to me. And I found the longer I live up here, the more of these funny things I encounter or hear about. Another one that happened to me personally that involves dogs is I have a remote cabin. It's not real remote. It's just like a 2 to 3 mile hike from the nearest roadway. I love it up there. I've made sure that I only walk in. I don't take a four-wheeler. So I don't have four-wheelers following behind me on this trail. Only a few people have gone up it on foot as well. When I was first establishing the route up to my cabin, I was constantly getting lost, and I was wandering into this drainage, particularly on my way back down, that I eventually, in my head, I gave it the frankly derogatory name of Ape Canyon. I just felt funny in there. I felt uncomfortable. I felt like I was being watched or something. I didn't like being in this area. And it's nothing special. I called it canyon, but it's really just a drainage with high ridges on both sides. Wasn't much. But the last time I came down to this canyon, I found half of a dog. Talk about making something that makes you feel uncomfortable. It was half of a dog. It was the rear half. It wasn't a big dog, but it was big enough. It couldn't have been picked up by a raptor or an eagle. I just don't buy it. It was a dog that probably, when both halves were together, would have weighed 20 pounds. Not a huge dog, but it was just half of a dog. It wasn't like terribly ripped. It was almost like evenly cut right below the rib cage. And I could tell it was like salt and pepper. It was kind of curly. I found that half of the dog. I climbed up to the nearest ridge where my route now is, and I call that ridge to this day Half Dog Ridge. I made calls about that dog. I contacted people. I had somebody else take a look at Facebook, seeing if anybody was reporting a missing dog. Nothing. Just found half of a dog laying out there. There was a little bit of blood under the dog. I turned it over. There was a little bit of blood there, but not much. So I think whatever happened, that piece that I found had been carried and left there. But I sure don't go down into that drainage. No, thank you. Another time, very close to my cabin, I found a moose kill site right next to my trail, like about 20 feet off the trail. When I say moose kill, I mean something had killed a moose. Even though I'd been up there just 2 weeks before, it was already just bones. The skeleton was mainly disarticulated. There wasn't much hanging together. It was really picked over. I found one femur, which I have to this day, which I couldn't really understand. It was broken. It wasn't like shattered. It was broken, like something had snapped a stick almost. And very recently I read an academic paper, and it was talking about how one way to get at the marrow and bones, particularly long bones, is to hang on to one end of the bone and hit it violently, the other end, against something. And it will break the bone. And it had picture examples in the paper, and they look like this bone that I have to this day up at my cabin. I would almost rather believe that this was a Sasquatch meal site than it was a grizzly, because if I had walked up when a grizzly was feeding on a moose right next to my trail, that would be very, very bad. So, frankly, I hope it was Sasquatch. Another time on this trail, I get little hints all the time. I found a short section of aspen stick poked into the middle of my trail. And it's true, things are falling out of the sky. It's woods. There's lots of aspens. There were aspens nearby. There were standing dead aspens nearby. But I don't know if any of you out there can recall a time when you have found that a stick that has fallen out of the trees has managed to jam itself 2 or 3 inches down into the dirt, let alone it being precisely in the middle of my trail. This is an area that I had already made a little detour. I used to cut straight across this. It's an open area of Labrador tea and moss, and it just felt weird to me cutting through there. And I actually made this detour around it to be closer to hard ground, easier walking. But I actually added distance on my hike to go here, and it still feels a little strange there. It's like I'm on the edge of something, and I've also had a tree break over the trail there. So it feels just a little weird, but that stick was like a message. It was like, we're here, we know you're here, and you know we're here. So that was a funny one for me. Up at the cabin, I'll try to wrap this up now for you. I've also found a large asterisk laying on the ground. This wasn't a glyph. A ground glyph typically is pretty small. This was like 10 to 20 foot logs forming, laying on the ground, what just looks like an asterisk. I was with my ex-girlfriend at the time, and she saw it and she said, "That looks like somebody made that." She also had an unsettling experience another time when we got to the cabin, and my cabin door was wide open. The door opens out. So it was hard to explain it as wind blowing it open. Every window in the house was shut. There's only 3 openers, but they were all shut. So I couldn't really explain why the air pressure in the cabin got high enough, even if I forgot to latch the door, which I doubt. I don't think that would have blown the door open. So that was strange. It was also strange that it had been open long enough. There were leaves blown into the cabin. And my girlfriend at first refused to go in. And I went in and I looked around and said, no problem in here. And I finally got her in. But that was odd. I've also on that cabin, I've had spruces broken over the trail or next to the trail. In one case, it was 3 spruces. They were 15 to 20 feet high. They were broken 5 to 7 feet off the ground. They were all pointed in the same direction. They couldn't be missed by me walking on the trail. It was actually spring when I found them, and they were broken on top of snow. But annoyingly, I could not find tracks in the old snowpack. They could have melted out. I don't know. It could have been the trees. I can't explain it. These were undergrowth trees. There's a higher canopy there. They were broken not with the prevailing winds. I can't explain through conventional means why those trees were broken. They were living green trees. They were just snapped. But there they were. I've had a little bit of the paranormal associated with some of my events, both in Massachusetts and up here in Alaska. To continue on this Alaskan theme, this one to me was very strange. This dates from 2022. I was thinking about Sasquatch a whole lot while walking up to the cabin, as you can perhaps understand. I was getting the feeling that there were Sasquatch in the area and that maybe they were interested in my going back and forth to the cabin. I was just thinking about the nature of Sasquatch and my relationship to them if they were in the area, what that meant. And I was just getting to the cabin. I unlatched that door, which was latched this time. I step into the cabin, and I'm still thinking about this subject, about what that would mean for me with this remote cabin. And I approach the thermometer, and I am literally thinking to myself, it's a little epiphany. I think, man, if they wanted to, it would be so easy for them to drive people like me back to the populated places. As I'm thinking this, I look at my thermometer hanging on a nail on the wall, as I always do. I'm wrapping up that thought as I read the thermometer. I just start to turn my head away, and the thermometer pops off the wall and lands at my feet. The timing was so eerie, and that thermometer never before and never after has magically come off that nail on the wall. It was that one time while I was thinking that thought about how it'd be so easy to drive people like me away from remote cabins. And I don't think it's a coincidence, but that brings up so much because I was not talking out loud. This was a conversation with myself in my head that I thought was private, but I don't think it was private. So that's, to me, an interesting one. A couple other things that have happened since then. The next year, a friend of mine, who, by the way, had a daytime sighting in Denali National Park of a Sasquatch on a river bar moving quadrupedally. He was with another person. They had time to watch and observe it. They mentally went through not a bear, not a caribou, not a wolf. And in the end, he said to the person he was with, I think that's a Bigfoot. And the person he was with said, I think you're right. In Denali National Park, of all places. This same guy, he tells me, hey, are you aware that there's something like these stick structures you keep showing me pictures of down by the visitor center in the woods? And he took me to it eventually. In August of 2023, I went to it. I call it the playpen. This is literally 500 feet from the visitor center of Denali National Park and Preserve. But it's in the woods, and it was in an area with no trails, but I believe since the structure been made, they put in a trail going by it. And you could see the stick structure there. It's old, it's falling apart. It's fallen apart even more since 23 when I saw it. To me, it should be like part of the ranger programs. I call it the playpen because it looks like a rudimentary fence enclosing an area 10 feet wide by 20 feet long. It's kind of an elongated ellipse. It's utilizing some trees that are there, but it was downed willow branches and the like that made it of the walls that were still up when I was there. It looked like it was 4 or 5 feet tall. And all I could come up with is something made it to put infants in so they could go forage for food and not be as worried about anything messing with the kids. And this is outside of the visitor center. Crazy. I've been gifted on my trail. I just a couple days ago found out that the water bottle I found hanging off of a branch stub at my cabin did indeed belong to another family that has a cabin about 3/8 of a mile away. But to explain how it got from their cabin to my cabin and not left on my porch where maybe a passing hunter would think, oh, it's probably his, I'll leave it on his porch. It was left hanging off of a stub about 80 feet up a bank from my cabin, but right on my trail, so I couldn't help but see it. Another one was an old fire grate was left at the bottom of my trail, and I use it. Works out to be a great trivet on my wood stove at the cabin. My most recent experience here in Alaska was I stopped at a horse's pen. I saw a horse. It's just outside of the town here that I live near. I wanted to give the horse an apple that I had. I cut the apple into quarters. I walk up to the horse. I'm feeding the horse these apple quarters. It's not my horse, by the way. I don't even know the owners, but I felt sorry for the horse in this little pen. I'm feeding the horse these quarters, and I notice its mane is braided. Everywhere I go, I'm into stuff. I don't know. This is the typical braiding that happens on horses' manes. It's not a human braid technique where you divide the lock of hair into three and you overlap them. It's this kind of twisted thing. It's two twists and they come together. They're all twisted together near the bottom of these twists that holds the twist and the hair up above. I don't know. It could be a wind effect. It was really windy that day. I have no idea, but it looks just like what you see in all the pictures. I even sent it off to Dr. Igor Burtsov in Russia, and he just typed back, oh yes, with a thumbs up. I don't know what to make of it, but this is my life here in Alaska. Things are happening. The suet I put in the bird feeders disappears constantly. I will watch suet over the course of 2 weeks. Birds are just pecking at it. It's still a solid block. Next morning, there's no suet whatsoever in the feeder. That happens. Once again, there could be other explanations, but it's a funny life here in Alaska. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves and the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. The sound of a memory brings me back to the blue 8-track. It's pick 'em and it been through it. Getting through the day on Scruggs and Skags, bucking hay bales to those Tennessee jams. There's no other way that I do it. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Something going backwards and double time. Looking at the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Pace of the city life drives me wild. The only tune is the cars rushing by, with the bass on the stereos booming. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Something going backwards and double time. Looking at the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Something going backwards and double time. Looking at the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm, fried chicken, porch swing, mama's best sweet tea kind of sound.